Hello.
Hello, hello.
How you doing?
I am doing excellent.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so today we're going to be reviewing the Communist Manifesto. This is one of the most historically important pieces of political philosophy ever written. Especially important during the 20th century, but continues to be somewhat important today. I have read this before, but it was a long, long time. It was probably 25 years ago because I'm old. And my general opinion on it as of right now is I tend to agree with a lot of the communist critiques of capitalism, but I tend not to be optimistic about communist societies necessarily doing much better. You got anything you want to add?
Yeah, I've never reviewed this, but I'm not a communist. I think capitalism is a lot like democracy. There's a great Churchill quote about democracy, which says, "Democracy is the worst system for government. It's just better than every alternative." Which is to say that I think that capitalism is very flawed, has a lot of problems, but oh my god, it has a lot less problems than everything else that we've tried.
Maybe so. I mean, like obviously the capitalist systems of today are actually tempered with a lot of kind of welfare state
Yeah, it
stuff.
gets into what does it truly mean? Capitalism versus communism, socialism, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
And I think a lot of the reason that we have those things today is because of the influence of historical socialists pushing for that stuff. So I don't want to like paint it as if this is all bad but
Yeah. Without further ado. Oh wait. With further ado, because I need to stream my picture-in-picture. There we go.
thank you.
Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communist?
Okay, I don't think it's like really that relevant, but I just hate this thing that people do when it's like, bro, everyone is aligned against us. Like, that makes me think that they probably have a good reason. Like, not to say that that's automatically true, but I feel like people always do this thing, like, it kind of feeds into, like, humans love, having that victim mentality.
Yeah.
Oh my God, people are like, everyone is united against us. Damn, that must be a really good reason to not like you then. Like, that's my immediate first thought.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know what they're going to say the reason is, though, right? It's like because
Yeah,
they're
because
trying to
they-
hold on to their grip
Yeah.
on power, and we're a threat to them or something like that, right? Which is true. It's,
Yep.
By its opponents in power. Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. 1. Communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. 2. It is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto, to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Section 1. Bourgeois and Proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles.
Oh God, why would you say that? Obviously, class struggle is a part of it. Oh God, major historicism alarm bells going off right now.
yeah, I know. It's just like it's the thing that like I usually associate this type of mentality with like young college students who have just come across some new frame of analysis with which they can look at the world, and now when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and so it's like all of the world is explained by this one thing. You see this with communists, you see it with psychology students, you see it with all kinds of different people. But
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, I'm sure through much of, if not all of history, the relation of economic classes of people was relevant. Sure, absolutely, but all of history, come on now.
Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby, to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, under which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guildmasters were pushed on one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant, modern industry, the place of the industrial middle class, by industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its time, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, here independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, there taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France, afterwards, in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself, in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary.
Like that kind of assumes like a it assumes that the interests or the desires of the bourgeoisie could be boiled down into one cohesive thing, and certainly there would be places where they would be aligned. For example, I'm sure that if you poll all the bourgeoisie, none of them would want an end of the human race. And I'm sure we could think of even more specific ones that might actually be in their interest. But I feel like earlier when they were talking about the ways in which guild masters were sort of pushed by markets, there was sort of an acknowledgement there that these things are subject to markets themselves as well. And this is now kind of presenting a view in the opposite, the idea that the whole interest of the bourgeois class can be boiled down to a single thing, when in fact I feel like there's a lot of internal competition.
I don't think it actually matters that much whether their interests can be boiled down to a single thing, because regardless of whether they can or whether they can't, I think the complaint makes sense that governments are disproportionately looking out for the interests of a single group of people, right? That would matter regardless of whether that group of people has a unified set of interests or not, right?
Well, I think it would matter in the sense of what is that interest that they are looking out for, and is that really an interest of all the bourgeoisie or of some of them? If you're making the claim that they're doing X because all bourgeoisie want X and many bourgeois do not want X, then I feel like this is a sort of flawed explanation.
I mean, maybe, but the thing is, I'm not sure that all of this can be boiled down to just specific policy actions. I'm sure some of it can, right? Of course there are going to be different economic interests of bourgeoisie people versus people of different economic station, right? But I'm not sure that that. Let me think. How do I put this? Even if you had a particular social class of people whose interests were not necessarily that much aligned or unified within themselves, it would still matter that group of people holds most of the power, and that their interests are different from the rest of society, even if they're not unified within themselves, right?
I could see that.
Yeah, okay.
Part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless and indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade.
I feel like a lot of things here are not actually that bad. When we talk about a really great example I love to use is Twitch streams or streamers, celebrity personalities. There is this argument that gets made, oh, I can't believe you're boiling everything down to money. You're getting rid of this critical human emotional element. Sometimes it's good for things to be professional and clinical and not to be steeped in human emotionality. Like with Twitch streamers, we recognize parasocial relationships. That's actually really kind of weird. The fact that you're watching the stream all the time, and it's not just a financial transaction. You actually feel like you're attached to this person, and that's muddying the relationship. It's actually quite good in certain respects. That, for example, you don't view your boss as your friend. You view your boss as your boss. You're nice to them, they're nice to you, but this is a professional relationship, and let's not let our emotions get in the way here. For another great example would be the idea of passion exploitation. There's this idea that industries where workers are disproportionately more likely to be passionate about their work. For example, video game development or teachers are more likely to be exploited because they are willing to take worse conditions before walking out because of that emotional entanglement. So I feel like he's sort of just, saying these, assuming they're, bad. And of course, this is a manifesto. It's not like, an argumentative essay trying to set everything out necessarily. But like, I really think that this is something that people take for granted as like a bad thing. And I really don't think it necessarily is. Sometimes it is good to have a dispassionate, critical perspective on things.
Yeah, well, I mean, the point that he's trying to make is about the the values of earlier historical European societies kind of getting replaced by the values of 19th century European industrial society, and I think he's descriptively correct on that. And as far as whether he thinks it's bad or not, I have a really hard time knowing that, like, because it's hard for me to think that Karl Marx would actually have been super positive about like feudal chivalry or something like that, right? It doesn't. I mean,
I guess to me it definitely felt like he was saying that this was like sort of like an insidious and bad thing that was occurring, not to necessarily endorse what was previously before, but the idea that this has negatively infiltrated all other sort of systems of value and evaluation. It definitely, that could just be me.
Yeah. Well, no, I think I like halfway agree with what you're saying, because I think he definitely is expressing some disapproval of the values of capitalist society, and I'm not sure that he necessarily would say that it's worse than what came before it. And in this part, I think he's just saying like kind of giving a brief history of his like class analysis and talking about how the values of this society are now heavily influenced by capitalism because of the political dominance of capitalism, which I think is true. So, good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers.
Yeah, I think that's, man, I don't know. Like, I think that's kind of good looking at like where we came from.
Yeah, it could be. Like, I'm not sure we would ever want to go back to like a guild system or something, but yeah.
Bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie...
Is it? Maybe Marx was just really predicting like tax in the future. They're going to tax advantage family households. Oh my God. Like, sure, I guess that like, you could, I understand, I literally can comprehend the argument that like, oh my gosh, I don't think we should be financially incentivizing the creation of families or have any sort of relation between finances and family, because that union should be wholly in a vacuum, absent everything. But equally, like, is it really like if the institution of family is so strong and so important, is it really going to come crashing down if like, money is now a factor? Like, I really don't think so. And in the opposite direction, there are lots of ways in which we can strengthen families, encourage families by having tax advantage stuff like that. Like we do, like we want more families to happen, so we offer more family leave. We say that we will lessen your financial burdens or financially incentivize you. So yeah, I just fundamentally disagree. It actually feels like? It feels like a sort of nostalgia. And rose-tinted glasses for, back in the day, families were this holy, pure thing that didn't have anything bad or worldly about them, when in reality they were. Like, I kind of feel like this is like one of those people talking about video games. It's like, I can't believe video games are all political now. Back in the day, they were fine and just about games. It's like, bro, your favorite game growing up was BioShock. Like, you just didn't realize it, or it wasn't in the forefront. But like, it doesn't feel like the things he's describing. First off, I don't think they're bad, and secondly, man, these have always been true. There's always been worldly and more, I guess, decrepit considerations. I guess maybe he would place the specific formulation of like monetary influence as uniquely bad, but I think that's foolish.
I don't think he's as much talking about the relationship of the family to the government or to other like external economic entities. I mean, I'm kind of, maybe I'm just, got my own interpretation in my head here, but where I think he's going with this is actually like what is it that binds the family together as a unit? And I think he's saying that like a lot of the more traditional reasons for families to stick together in like, tribal or feudal societies have now just been replaced by this relationship of economic dependency.
Yeah, I can see that. I just feel like the things that, that economic dependency replaced were probably even worse.
Yeah, perhaps, but like I don't know, like I don't think we would want a situation where economic dependency is the only thing holding families together, right? Though I mean, I think
No, I'd agree there, but I don't think it is, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think it was the case that, before the economic dependency it was necessarily a bunch of, I don't think economic dependency replaced a bunch of good things. Like I don't think it went from like families used to stick together because they loved each other and believed in each other, and now they're just together because of money. Like I think like the ratio of like, genuine human compassion and things we would like broadly describe as like good for keeping a marriage together probably did not change significantly. And that rather there is just a change of like, the particular, social phenomenon that encourage and bind marriage. Now it's economic dependency. Previously it was, arranged marriages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it was just the earlier societies were a lot more like clannish, and where your personal identity was just very closely tied into your family background, and then capitalist society was becoming more individualistic.
Yeah.
Has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionists so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders, far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones.
What? This kind of dude, I feel like I'm listening to like a boomer, like being like back in my day.
It is.
Wow, I had no idea. Man, I really, I think there's, I think a lot of the social changes we got out of industrialization were good, particularly down the pike. Not to say that there weren't, bad, kids going in coal mines. That's a unique badness sort of spike right at the beginning. But wow, yeah, I really don't disagree. And man, I guess it's difficult to argue because there's not like or to really argue and grapple because there aren't like specific contentions. But like I'd be curious, like what are these past revolutions that were like so much better? Like because I feel like if you talk to people back during the time of those revolutions, and I feel like objectively so, like yeah, at the time they felt the exact same way. Like I can't believe Martin Luther and the Protestants are tearing apart the church like this. Or for example, a lot of the economic uplifting came out of the Black Death. The fact that there weren't enough peasants to go around, so lords had to actually start actually offering them things instead of just lording over them. There's a lot of I really disagree with the notion that the previous revolutions were somehow, or rather that the Industrial Revolution and this revolution that Marx is talking about is somehow uniquely destructive or uniquely bad. Certainly it is one of the most consequential, but like I don't think it is uniquely bad in its consequences as opposed to the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's trying to point to is the kind of quickening pace of technological innovation and the way that that's upending a lot of society in his time, and that really is different from previous historical eras. But so and I think he's attributing a lot of that to like capitalism, basically. That like the need for constant like new products is fueling this like I don't know, technological upheaval. But I think I mostly agree with you that this isn't actually like worse necessarily than what was happening in earlier times. I mean, there were earlier historical empires that were just having like constant civil wars between their aristocracy, just because those people were competing for power in a different way. Like,
it's like the classic, like it's sort of the inverse of like the grass is always greener. Like, lots of left-leaning people and people that would more strongly identify with communists will make this argument all the time. The only reason why the horrors of my system seem so bad is because you're so inoculated and used to the horrors of capitalism. You don't view the people who starve to death because of capitalism, because they can't afford food. You don't view those deaths as like some awful tragedy in the way that you view like the deaths under communism. Now, I don't agree with that argument, but I feel like that kind of logic is certainly something you should keep in mind. You can become inoculated. It's like the battered wife. You get used to the really bad thing that you're experiencing. Humans are great at adapting to horrible conditions and getting used to it. So it's definitely a principle that is true, and I think he's kind of doing it here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must.
Okay, I do not understand why people always say that infinite and exponential growth is a necessary precondition or necessary thing for capitalism to fulfill. Certainly, I understand why it certainly pushes in that direction, but to say that capitalism must always necessitate an exponential growth assumes a zero-sum equation of economic interaction, that in order for there to be gains, increasing economic gains, there must be increasing material gains, or even that in order for there to be mutually beneficial gains, there must be gains in the net. I just don't think this is true. It doesn't make sense to me that you inherently need constant expansion in a way that isn't just true of human existence. If the human population constantly grows, then we're constantly going to need more resources. And I mean, it's funny because if anything, all the best data right now does point towards the idea that actually we're going to have a human population decline, and that as capitalism has made more and more developments, relating to your ease of the ability for you to live through life without children, means that actually we are going to need to try and find ways to encourage people to have more children as opposed to produce them. The population bomb and all the overpopulation doomsaying turned out to be completely wrong in the opposite direction. So I just don't think that maps onto reality very much. Certainly capitalism requires constant change, and innovation, but the idea that innovation and change must come from expansion and that therefore it's inevitably doomed because there's an upper limit, I don't think that's particularly compelling.
Yeah, if you're talking about present day capitalism, then I think I probably agree with you. Although I have only limited knowledge of economics, so maybe there is some reason why capitalism is more dependent on perpetual growth than we think it is. There could be some reason that we're just overlooking, but regardless of whether it applies today, it is historically correct that these capitalist societies were the ones that were kind of marauding over the whole globe, that kind of consuming the resources of every this was coinciding with colonialism, and it's probably not entirely a coincidence that was the case.
Yeah, I think I think that there is a really big problem disambiguating capitalism from inherent human vices, and there's always
Yeah.
this argument that comes, and in fact, I think, not all, but many advocates against capitalism will sort of sometimes play the shell game, where on the one hand, capitalism is this highly evolved thing, on the other hand, capitalism sometimes our worst basal instincts, and I feel like this is one of these categories where it's like, okay, I don't think capitalism is responsible for humans wanting more things, and I think that while certainly the most successful nations at taking more things have been capitalist ones, I think that has a lot more to do with the ability of capitalism to be successful than it does capitalism having a unique desire or drive to go and take things. And if you're going to say that it is actually, oh no, that is capitalism, right? When Genghis Khan, had, I think the second largest empire in the world, I think the British Empire was only greater. That sort of greed and desire is still a form of, capitalism or markets or greed or anything like that. It's like, okay, well then, what the fuck are we talking about? Like, then this is like such a base human part of psychology. So I feel like you can't have it both ways. Either capitalism is, part of the innate human, there's the desire for humans to get more things and to expand is very innate. If capitalism is part of that, then we're not getting rid of it, like ever. Like, we can only hope to moderate it. Have a mixed economy perhaps. But if it isn't, if capitalism is something we can truly divorce ourselves from, and in fact, when capitalist people say it is part of human nature, they're making a naturalistic fallacy, and that's not true. Well, then I don't think it is fair to say that capitalism is, necessarily responsible for the vices of humans to constantly want and take and get more things, because that seems to be present throughout, all of human history, regardless of the presence of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism is definitely not, the one and only explanation for human greed. Like of course we've had, empires and I don't know, people just like with destructive ambitions have been there historically long before capitalism, and will probably be there long after if we ever get past it. But like I think there is kind of like a different way that you could look at it, where it's like, okay, here's a vice that humans have, which is aggravated or encouraged by capitalism in a way that goes beyond what other systems do.
I think you could make a fair criticism of that nature.
Yeah, and I think that is what Marx is trying to do, because he's got this kind of like idealized vision of a society that is less materialistic, less greedy, or whatever. I'm not super optimistic about his vision for that, but I think that is the critique he's trying to make, is about the materialistic values being promoted by capitalism.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea, and I definitely don't inherently disagree with that kind of critique. The idea that a system could be worse at exacerbating a flaw in human psychology, but I think then that criticism would then come down to like a material analysis, like a descriptive analysis of how much worse are these things under capitalism versus how much worse were they elsewhere, and how much is really capitalism to blame for the unique exacerbation now. And I feel like, at least in my estimation, I feel like capitalism has a lot less to do with the particularly pernicious forms of expansion that were happening during this time than I think Marx is saying.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Marx is trying to do exactly that kind of analysis. And obviously has a different opinion than you have, but
Yeah.
Nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed, or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In place of the old wants, satisfied by the productions of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. in place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every
Oh,
direction.
can we pause again?
Yeah, or you can go first. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, it's ironic for Marx to be making this critique when communism is so often associated with globalism, right? It's like the society that Marx wants to replace this with would also be a cosmopolitan society that's sharing resources among everyone in every part of the world, right? So I don't know that it makes a lot of sense to say that capitalism is bad for doing the same thing that he seemingly wants to do.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a self-report to be like, and capitalism is making things that are so awesome, people refuse to live without. It's like, damn, bro, I don't think this is like the case you're trying to make. Like,
Well, you can have different explanations for people wanting things. It doesn't have to be the things are so awesome.
well, I feel like that's kind of what he's saying when he says, like, people will no longer be satisfied. I don't know. I guess the other thing that this particular segment made me think about is like I don't buy like this idea that like, oh, there's like this no inherent interconnectedness that is bad. Why? Like, the idea of like self-sufficiency, you know, sounds good and can be good in certain contexts, but it's not inherently, my car is not self-sufficient, but it's a lot better than walking, if you have to travel long distances, I feel like there's just sort of this assumption of like, oh, interconnectedness and we're not self-sufficient. I mean, sure, we're more dependent now than we were previously, but even back in the day, there was, even back in the day, especially, I mean, Jesus, the Communist Manifesto is like what, like 1848? I think is what I looked up before. Before we start streaming this, 1848, bro. Like, you are pretty early into the idea of like a nation state. Like, you don't have to go that far back in history for even the idea for totally separate nation states to be sort of a novel concept. And in that era, it was absolutely not like, oh, the state of France is totally self-sufficient and independent from all these other things. No, there's always a level of interconnectedness. Sure, it's gone up, but like, man, there is still a huge dependency that has always existed. Be it through plagues or human relations, trade. All the cultural exchange. There is no such thing as a nation that is truly independent and isolated and has no codependencies.
Well, no, but it's not true that there's no such thing. It's just like these would have been like remote island nations or things like that, right?
Oh yeah.
Also, I kind of I don't want to like when we say like, yes, it's that there was always like international trade going on and like, sure, it's gone up. I sort of feel like that's understating the case, because it's like this is a time period during which international trade was not just going up, it was like dramatically going up in a way that was changing the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. International trade was massively spiking, but I think if you compare the codependence of like international trade to like the codependence of like, for example, like the way in which diseases can travel across nation states, like in the broad picture, there actually is I think not a massive spike in codependence. I think codependence was massively increasing, in the economic realm. But if you look at, for example, the inherent codependence of like, plagues or cross-cultural exchange or wars, you are dependent, in order to have a peaceful existence, you are dependent on other nations not invading you, not attacking you. There was still a lot of codependence that already existed. And I feel like that's kind of being undercounted when you say, now we're massively codependent because of trade. It's like, sure, trade has massively spiked in its interconnectivity, but like there was already huge interconnectivity in many other realms of life. And I feel like there's a real discounting here of that.
It's just like if you're in Marx's time period and you're kind of looking back to what was the world like a couple hundred years ago, you would have seen a lot of places that were a lot more isolated, like especially outside of Europe, right? Like a lot of the places that were being colonized in Marx's time were places that had not had a huge like interconnectedness with other with the rest of the world economically.
Yeah, I agree economically.
Yeah, so it's like I think you could kind of conceive of this break as being like, well, before we had a bunch of local economies with some limited amount of interconnectivity between them, but now it's making less and less sense to even conceive of it that way, and it's now more that we are building a global economy that is being fueled by the rise of industry.
Yeah, I just feel like it came off to me in that statement that he was describing this as like a really bad thing, that people are no longer satisfied with, self-sufficiency and the local solutions. And I feel like that analysis is sort of undercut by the fact that even in that previous world, there was huge interdependence and interconnectivity, just not in the realms of economic. And so it seems kind of weird to then have a unique problem when the economic realm becomes more interconnected, when it already was the case that many other things were massively interconnected. And not self-sufficient or independent.
What do you make of the point about? Well, I mean, I think you kind of gave a little bit of an opinion about this already, but on the point about like capitalism encouraging like consumerism or materialistic values.
I think you could definitely make the case that it exacerbates it to some degree, but I think the nature of that degree is going to be massively contested depending upon where you fall on the idea of capitalism as a very evolved system that is exploiting some of our worst human psychologies versus how much you try to say that, humans are not really that fundamentally greedy and capitalism is really taking this to the extreme. Because, like, to my view, I really don't think that it actually exacerbates it that much at all. I think that the desire for humans to want things and take things and need things, is going to exist no matter what, and capitalism just makes those things more readily available, and it can encourage you to have some pressure on you to have those kinds of things, but like the want for that is I think 80-70% already there. I think this is a particular discussion that would really come down to the specific details. How much do you think it's making it worse? Because there's a big gamut of range there.
Yeah, I actually do give this point by Marx like probably more credence than you're giving it. Like I think capitalism actually does increase the priority of those values within the cultures that practice it, because it's like, why do people even want to have things in the first place? I mean, sure, there are a lot of different reasons why they might, but like. I think a big reason for people to even have greed in the first place is not even necessarily because of the material comforts that you can get by having those things, or it's more to do with like social status and security. And in capitalistic societies, social status and security are just really bound up with your material wealth in a way that they aren't as much in pre-capitalist societies.
Yeah, I guess I could see the argument that that there would be you would be materialist for things that aren't material, as much as that doesn't make any literal sense. I could see that argument. I guess it's more a question.
There were other ways to attain social status and high standing in your community besides just being rich. I think would be right. Like you could.
I think that's probably more of a fair argument that I'd agree with. I think there's also a separate contention, which is like, I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but like I really don't think materialism is that bad. I think it's actually massively thrown under the bus. But I think that the sort of like middle class consumerist materialist life like ideals. JJ McCullough has some videos on this that heavily inspired my opinion in this matter. But yeah, I really don't think there's anything that wrong with that. And it's funny you actually mentioned that. Now that I'm thinking about it, I feel more convinced of this position, because like you're right, there were other ways for societies to get social status, and sometimes they were really way worse. Things like marriages, which led to arranged marriages, or chivalric codes of honor. The idea that the way you change your social status is with the most interchangeable, flexible currency of value, literally currency, makes it more accessible. Certainly, it still has its flaws and its limits, and we can look at not to say materialism is inherently good, but I think the way in which materialism is often expressed, in like middle class culture and like America at the very least. I mean, that's what I'm most familiar with, really isn't nearly as bad as people say it is.
Oh, this is like I think a pretty big disagreement between you and me. I do think it's pretty bad. Like if you want to go to the historical comparison, I think I can get on board with that one more. That like other societies had other ways for people to gain social status, and those were often bad in their own ways as well. Like I will agree with that one. I think those things were destructive to those people's lives in a lot of the same ways that materialism is destructive to modern people's lives. I think it's just those things were also bad.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think that like my evaluation of things is always going to be in context, and I think materialism seems like in the same way. I think capitalism is not perfect, but it seems way better than all the others. I think I feel a similar way about materialism.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, like, with the capitalism thing, I think I mostly agree with you. It's not that I think capitalism is great, or that I'm going to discount the criticisms of it that like Marxists and others might make. I actually agree with most of their critiques of it, but it's more like, okay, well then let's see you do better, and I'm yet to be convinced that they will, right? But on the materialism thing, I have like a pretty big difference about that. I think people that do have less materialistic values do tend to be a lot happier. So yeah.
Just 1 second, I've got to fix my stream quality by grabbing a cable. So I'll be right back. Just give me like 90 seconds.
Yep. Part of what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about this thing about materialistic values, I do a philosophy reading group, and lately we've been reading Seneca, the ancient Roman guy, and he was an aristocrat in ancient Rome, very very wealthy and powerful man. He was a tutor to the emperor of Rome, right? So very high status guy, and this is a guy who would tell you that. That having that kind of high status is not what makes for a happy life, and I think that there's a lot of kind of modern research that supports this as well. Like I think having your basic material needs met really does matter a lot, right? Like having health and safety and good nutrition, this kind of stuff really does make a big difference in your quality of life. But once you get beyond that, once like consumption and acquisitiveness become ends to themselves and not just like a means to meet your basic needs, then I think they start to become destructive. And people who are consumed with those things do it at the expense of other values that they might spend their time and emotional energy on, right? Like there are people who will dedicate more or less dedicate their lives to their career, and then like spend less time with their family, or spend less time with the things that they're personally passionate about, or whatever. I mean, it's just so basically, like, I mean, I guess my take on materialism is that it's a thing that's good in moderation, right? Like get what you need, and don't become preoccupied with getting more than what you need.
Yeah, I definitely think there are negative ways in which materialism can be expressed. I just think that the idea of getting social status or value or happiness from that, how do I say this? From the sort of acquisition of material goods is necessarily a bad thing. And I think that actually has some very good applications when you look at, I think when you look at like suburban middle class life, there are many aspects in which, Christmas is, and be able to, get someone a material thing as a means of expressing, gratitude or happiness or social status. I think that is a broadly good thing.
What do you make of the connection between this and the like red pill ideology? Like how they're often very preoccupied with being like a high status man by just having a lot of material possessions and high social status.
Yeah, I think like that's it taken to like an extreme that makes it very bad. I think the nice form of materialism that I like and consumerism is taking simple joys out of it. I really like this new video game I bought. I have so much fun with it. I love that. My friend wants this thing and I can very easily get it for them. I think when the particular problem with the red pills engagement with materialism is that it becomes, I think, all-consuming. It no longer just becomes just a nice thing that's nice to have, that you get some utility out of. It becomes almost like epistemologically important. Like it's important for me as a person existing to be able to have those materials.
Self-image, it becomes heavily dependent on how much. Yeah.
Whereas I think like the nice form of materialism that I like is it being, viewed positively as a means to access utility for happiness and self-worth and value and things like that. Like, and it is ultimately like secondary and complementary, right? I don't think I would, support a, implementation of materialism that, would place your material, well-being above everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. It's just that I think that a society that espouses or displays a lot of materialistic values is putting every person within it at high risk of being consumed by it in a similar way that the red pill people are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right on.
Universal interdependence of nations. And as in material, so also in intellectual production. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations into civilization.
Beautiful.
The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns.
Most ideologies.
It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population.
Oh, I really don't like the idea that capitalism and the bourgeois have increased the population of cities in comparison to the rural. That, to me, feels like a very natural consequence of the dynamics of rural versus urban life and of technology and prosperousness. I don't think you can attribute that to capitalism.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, you could say that capitalism has furthered it, though.
Yeah. That's fair.
From the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated production and has concentrated property in a few hands. The natural consequence of this was political centralization. Independent, or but loosely connected provinces, with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation, became lumped together into one nation, with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection.
Again, I feel like that's mostly due to industrialization and technology, which, while related to capitalism, I agree, is not capitalism.
Yeah, I agree.
Of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see then the means of production and of exchange, on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, In one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it, and by the economical and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the nether world whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie and of its rule.
Okay. Yes. The history of these productive forces is coming up and usurping existing productive forces. Yeah? Like, if you have a new method of creating a given good, of course that is going to, clash with and replace, if it is better, the existing method of making that good. I feel like I must be missing something here.
Yeah, you know what kind of bugs me a little bit about this type of analysis, and maybe it's not even because of what Marx is saying so much. It's more because of like what other Marxists have said to me is that a lot of people seem to view this type of analysis as if it were describing like inevitable historical forces, that because things did happen this way, therefore they must happen this way, that it's some like predictable feature of capitalist or feudal systems that they had to have evolved the way they did, which I think is not something that we should take for granted.
And it just seems like, again, like there is like I feel like you're sort of putting the cart before the horse here. Yes, the new productive modes replace the old productive modes, but like I need something like that. Of course, if we have new productive modes, of course they replace the old productive modes. Why should I be concerned? What is the unique badness in here? Sure, they prop up the current bourgeois, but again, that's almost tautological. Of course, an old process is going to replace a new process, and of course, of course, a new process is going to replace an old process, and of course, if that new process does replace the old process, well, then it must work, which means it must serve or be in function and help the people that are controlling of it, right? Like it feels like he's saying the new process that replaced the old process, it replaced the old process, and the new process that currently our society operates in actually operates in our society. Like, of course, it is going to be replacing the old one, and of course, it is going to be in service of or in the benefit to the biggest stakeholders in the society at the top. Like, I like, what would the alternative be? A new process that didn't replace the old process and somehow lives alongside without affecting or having, I guess you could say, maybe not as disruptive, right? Maybe it's an alternate pathway that is only somewhat competitive. And then again, a new process that is widely adopted. What does it look like for a new process that's widely adopted that would not serve whatever the upper classes, or at least be beneficial to the world that benefits the upper classes? The upper classes, by definition, have to be at the top, right? So, and if they are at the top, then by definition, the society helps them because they're at the top. So, of course, a part of the society helps them at the top when they're already at the top. I just don't think there's a lot of a good analysis here.
This makes me wonder what other stuff Marx was reading and that he was kind of dialoguing with when he was writing this, right?
Just copying his opinions from BreadTube. Wow, Marx. Not cool. Sorry.
A lot of this kind of reads as if he's like trying to rebut somebody else's ideology, right?
Well, it literally is a manifesto, so it would not be a surprise to for that to be the case, for there to be other competing manifestos that were out there that hit on a lot of points, that a lot of the points that he's trying to address here.
Yeah, and like my best guess is that he's probably trying to address a lot of the commonplace political beliefs of his time that probably weren't as tapped into this type of like, class-based analysis as what he was doing, right? Like I think he's kind of proposing like a larger scope of the relationship between the economy and the state than what people might have believed at the time. I don't know.
Yeah.
It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put on its trial, each time more threateningly, the existence of the entire bourgeois society. In these crises, a great part, not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces, are periodically destroyed. In these crises there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered, and so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men.
Okay. Again, I feel like this actually is like a good thing. Like the bourgeois capitalist system allows for creative production that actually unseats the people that are currently in power of production. Good. Yeah, like I wouldn't want it to be the case that the people who control production, the system just makes them immune and invincible. Like, I'm glad that, companies have to be worried about, well, what if a new company comes along and makes a better product than us, or comes with a better system, Oh God, what was the camera company that went belly up in the 2000s after the advent of digital cameras? Was it Kodak? Or I think Kodak is still around. There was some big camera company that in the mid 2000s got massively destroyed by the invention of new cameras. So yeah, I feel like this is another argument in favor.
Yeah, I don't know what camera company that is, but obviously there's many other examples of this, like where you don't see a lot of blockbuster videos anymore, right?
Yeah.
Who are to wield these weapons? The modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e., capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted, almost entirely, to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance, and for the propagation of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of the machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers, crowded into the factory, are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state.
Okay, slaves, really? Like, certainly we can look at the conditions, and to be fair to Marx, this is the time he was living in. Certainly factory conditions were very abominable and horrible. But the idea that, inherently going from a small production to a big production is a downgrade, I just don't think is true. I don't, it doesn't support that. In fact, again, I don't blame Marx for necessarily not realizing this, but like today, working at a really small company that probably doesn't have an HR department, where, the only person you go to with your problems is your boss, that actually is a lot more prone to abuse and exploitation a lot of times than like these big corporate structures. So yeah, I just feel like there is like an automatic value that's being given to like these smaller units of production of like working at like a small farm as opposed to a factory that I just don't think bears out in reality.
People do tend to like romanticize small businesses a lot, like even today. Yeah. But like, I'm not sure. Man, when you say the thing about like small businesses where your boss is the only person that you can go to as being more prone to abuse, I'm not sure I agree with that, because the smaller the business is, the more you've probably got like a close personal relationship with your boss, right? You're not having like decrees handed down to you from people who you'll never meet in your life, and an HR department who's not actually there to protect you, but is there to like address your complaints to the higher ups in their best interest.
Well, I think there's a little bit of like what I was talking about earlier with like sort of sometimes the cold clinical approach. Sometimes having that relationship with the boss, I think, is the area where that exploitation does come out, because you're viewing this person as a friend that you don't want to be harsh on, you don't want to do favors for. And while certainly HR departments are not perfect, their interest is in of the corporation, not necessarily of a given boss. So if there is a boss that, for example, does step out of line, that is just one manager in a huge corporation. They're gonna have no problem axing him. If he truly did step out of line. And this does happen. There are plenty of times where HR departments do go after, some middle manager who did step out of line, because they're there to protect the company, and this guy's a massive liability because he's, breaking labor law, he's being horrible to his employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not to say HR departments are, angels are always doing that, but I think like if you talked about like, I guess maybe the real thing is we just need data on this, but like it is my feeling, based off of the conversations I've had with people and just my personal experience, that it does feel like there is more of a potential for abuse when the interest of the company is the interest of your boss, because it's a small business and he owns it, versus being able to sort of go over your middle manager's head and talk to the HR department, and if they really did fuck up, then being able to have him axed or be moved to a different part of the corporation, things like that.
Yeah, so like I think I agree with part of this, which is that the worst case scenario of where you have a bad boss is probably worse under the small business, because like you said, like there's nobody above him that you can go to have recourse. It's just the thing is with the bigger company, I don't think it even requires anybody to be nefarious to have a lot of these problems, because it's like when all the policies that affect you are being handed down by people who have no personal relationship with you at all, then they don't even have to be assholes to make decisions that just don't take your interests into account, right?
I I agree. I think that I would draw a really important distinction between, a boss doing, a proper business, a business decision that is being made properly and appropriately through official channels that is detrimental to you versus, doing something that you really shouldn't be doing, personal harassment or, exploitation. If the corporation hands out a policy that says, we're not going to be giving you a raise and, that's not in your interest, then I agree that that's bad for you, but I don't think there's necessarily anything improper taking place in the corporation. Whereas, if there is workplace harassment, if there is, violation of labor laws, if there's, paying you under the table to avoid taxes, stuff like that, I feel like that kind of stuff is in a class of its own, and that stuff does, I think, happen more and has a higher percentage for abuse and to go unpunished in smaller businesses.
Yeah, so like skirting regulations is the one that I'll agree on. That's like definitely a thing that's going to be more common in smaller businesses. I'm not sure if it's true that, like, for example, like a culture of harassment is more likely to exist in a small business. That doesn't sound right to me, but maybe. Vels is in chat. He says, if you work for a small business, you probably have less vacation time, less time off, less sick days. For a small business, each worker is much more impactful, so your duties and expectations of you are higher.
Yeah, I think I to be fair, this is something that I think we probably just need to see data on to come to a conclusive opinion. But I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that there is higher abuse potential in this regard as small business. And I think there is really just a romanticization. I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a romanticization of small businesses. And I feel like that kind of phenomenon is going on here, where Marx is talking, where I shouldn't say Marx necessarily, because he's not the only one that worked on it. But the Communist Manifesto here is saying, that is trying to, say that, moving to these, big factories where you have all these hierarchies is a much worse thing. And I certainly understand why you might feel that way, when you're in the throes of these giant, factories. But again, I think that if you play it out in the real world over time and with more examples and with a more honest appraisal of some of the bad things that were going on before, the move to these massive factories, the kinds of abuse that did happen in, subsistence farming, where, you don't have a boss, you own your farm, but the local lord, effectively has, total control over that. Or, and sort of as that transitions to feudalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I think that sort of romanticization, that equation of automatically valuing those smaller sort of businesses more, I think falls apart.
Yeah, maybe. I wonder if we would have a much different perspective on this if we didn't know about the last 170 years of history since Marxist time, right? Because I think it makes a lot of sense. If you're seeing the early industrial era where basically like everybody's working in a sweatshop and you're kind of comparing this to kind of earlier agricultural and pastoral, like feudal cultures. I mean, like, sure, maybe he's romanticizing it, but it does make sense to say, like, this society that we're now building is experiencing a bunch of problems we've never had before, right? And those could be worth critiquing, even if they're not necessarily worse than the preceding society.
Yeah, I'm definitely sympathetic to the view, that happened, in the immediate aftermath, or I should say aftermath, in the immediate, initiation of industrialization. There was a lot of unique declines in that respect. But again, I think even in that respect, there's a lot. It's a lot more of a back and forth than I think is being led on. I, for one, happen to think that, at least in the modern context, sweatshops are a lot more desirable to people than subsistence farming. I think sweatshops are obviously bad and not ideal, and I think we should definitely push to try and make them more humane. But I don't like the insistence that sweatshops should not ever be a thing when the status quo for the people that are working in sweatshops is oftentimes much worse subsistence farming. And these are people who are choosing to work in sweatshops because they prefer it to subsistence farming. And I think there is a similar sort of lack of presenting, certainly sweatshops, when you see sweatshops, that's bad, that's awful, that's horrible. But when you say we should shut this down, you're not applying that same analysis to, well, what is the alternative? What are they going to be going back to? And I wonder if, I'm not familiar with the nature of, industrial shops and coal mines in comparison to subsistence farming in the 1800s, but I wonder if there's a similar phenomenon going on here.
Yeah, so let me point out also that the economic viability of the agricultural economy was probably also being damaged by industrialism, right? So like the alternative thing that they would go back to is now less of an option because the sweatshop is taking over the economy.
Yes, I think that there is. Well, yes and no. I think there is a part of that it depends what kind of subsistence farming we're talking about. If we're talking about a kind of subsistence farming that is truly just dependent upon itself to feed itself, that I don't think there is much relation to the sweatshop. If we're talking about more of a sort of partially developed economy, then yes, the economic viability of continuing to farm like that does get undermined because the economic productiveness of your neighbors and thus of the entire economy is being raised by the advent of the sort of industrial sweatshops.
Yeah, and this is particularly going to be the case in a lot of the countries outside of Europe, where it's like, okay, a lot of their population were subsistence farmers for thousands of years, and now they're having to compete with Europeans who are setting up like plantations, basically, that are just like out competing them.
Yeah.
So if the Europeans are coming in out competing them with these like highly efficient plantations and like industrialized production, then it's like and then setting up a sweatshop as the thing that replaces them. That then, like, I don't know how much sense it makes to say that, like, well, the sweatshop is better than the alternative when the alternative has also been poisoned by the same industrialization process, right?
I think it would be fair to consider the sweatshop. I think the problem when you try to consider the alternative of the sweatshop to the farming that has been affected is that, again, you're talking. When you then talk about what the actual alternative is, well, then that alternative is preventing development in the first place. That would mean preventing the advancement of medicine, of transportation, of clean water, of infrastructure, of national of stability of in the context of like crime and national security. So yes, if you do broaden that picture, there are more negatives, I think, on the side of like, the broadly pro-development, dare I say, pro-sweatshop side. But I think there also are then some broadened negatives, because then to prevent the development of that greater economic capacity that then makes people feel pressured to go into sweatshops, you also have to prevent, the adoption of medicine, of technology that massively improves the quality of life and saves lives in the first place. It's not possible, I think, for the nation to avoid any sort of economic development that leads to sweatshops, but then also still get all the benefits of that economic development of industrialization, of medicine and stuff like, and clean water and stuff like that. I guess maybe if there was just like eternal foreign aid, but I think that gets really messy too. Or at the very least, I can't think of one. Maybe there's an alternative out there by people that are smarter than me.
Well, I mean, okay, but Marx is trying to propose a social organization that takes advantage of the fruits of industrialization while being more like socially conscious about the the economic impact to poorer people, right? Like, I mean, if I
I just don't think that it works.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe not, but right, but I think that is the point that he's trying to make, is that we have despite there being a bunch of advantages to industrialization, you don't necessarily have to like just accept every bad thing about capitalism just because you want some of the good things, and I think it at least makes some sense to propose. I mean, not that I'm a Marxist or whatever, but I'm on board with the idea that if you identify problems in your society, that you should like, try to agitate for changes in those things, and that agitating for changes in those things doesn't necessarily mean that you're just rejecting every good thing that's come from it.
I think. I agree that you should try to solve problems. I don't. I guess the distinction between the argument that I was identifying previously is, and I guess the thing I would want to see is, I would want to see a specific example or implementation idea, and it doesn't need to be specific in the sense of what tax policy, but a specific hypothetical of these are the ways in which we will still use factories and industrialization and interdependence, but we will not have the worsening of factory conditions. We'll have factory conditions be good. Again, this is obviously the Communist Manifesto, which is supposed to be a much more bullet point, digestible kind of thing, but it does feel like it feels a lot more towards the side of factories and interdependence are bad, and less the ways in which these are coming about are bad and we should seek to reform them. We're only a little bit into it, so maybe we'll get some more of that. If it is making that case, that's a much better argument, but I just then don't think that the particular ways they have of getting to these things are good, or rather would work. I don't think these are ways that you can get to the world where we still have factories, we still have economic development, we still have economic interdependence, but we don't have kids working in coal mines.
Yeah, well, I mean, Marx is very big on the class analysis thing, so we already know where this is going, right? He's going to say that if you then give more power to the proletariat, then they'll make decisions that are more in their own best interests, right?
Yeah.
They are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and more embittering it is. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production. Thus the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie.
Can we pause for a second?
At first, the contest is carried.
I want to address the point that he was making a minute ago about he was saying no sooner are you paid your wages than you're set upon by the rest of the the bourgeoisie. And what this reminded me of is have you ever heard about the way that gambling works in Japan? Do you know?
No.
Okay. So basically in Japan they have laws where you can have gambling houses, but you can't be paid in cash by the gambling house. And so there are these workaround ways that they do it, where basically if you go to a casino in Japan, you'll win a bunch of toys or tokens or something like that, and then right next door to the casino is a business that will buy those back from you. And then a lot of times the next door place might even be just owned by the same people that own the casino, right? So now Marx isn't necessarily proposing something quite like that, because it's the owners of the people who are trying to sell you stuff aren't necessarily the same people that are trying to pay you, but he's saying they are part of the same social class, and in some instances they might actually be the same person who's paying you, right? Because if you've ever heard of company towns, for example, there would be towns that just where basically one factory dominates the entire town. Almost everybody who works in the town is employed by the factory, and then the person who owns the factory also owns all the stores in the town, and basically you have to go to them for your income and also for the things that you're going to spend your income on.
Yeah, I feel like that analogy sort of demonstrates, like, I think the difference between, like, the reason why I wouldn't like I do have a problem with that, but I don't have a difference with landlords requiring payment, because in the one it feels like there is a organized scheme, almost a conspiracy to exploit the money from you by having very few alternatives, right? Of sort of both the person you get your money from and the person you are then being charged being the same person. There's a sort of unique kind of abuse that can happen in this situation, but that doesn't seem to be the case with like a more open market where you have many different options to pursue.
Yeah, Vels says communism is basically just a big company town. And the thing is, I think Marx would probably agree with that, but he would just wants the company town to be owned by the proletariat and not by like a small elite class of the rich.
Carried on by individual laborers, then by the workpeople of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass, scattered over the whole country, and broken up by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover yet, for a time, able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it
Yeah, I feel like
feels that
saying this
strength.
is always a victory for the bourgeoisie. I mean, when you define the bourgeoisie as the people who win, then yeah, every victory for them is going to be one who wins. Like, if the nature of the bourgeoisie is as the people that are at the top of society and that are benefiting from society as it functions, then yeah, of course, every time society wins or benefits in its function, it's going to be the bourgeoisie. But I think that misses the fact that like people could theoretically go in or out of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I mean, I think his point is about the increasing consolidation of power in fewer and fewer people, right?
Yeah, I think that is a valid concern. And again, I think that if you wanted to talk about that, I would not be opposed. But it feels like there's like some muddling of both that idea, which I don't necessarily disagree with, and the idea of this like bourgeoisie class that is like manipulating, or not necessarily manipulating, but is like receiving all the inflows from all aspects of society. And that form of analysis, independent of any analysis of who is and isn't part of the bourgeoisie, and the idea that that can change. Because again, I feel like the idea that rich people can become more rich, or they can become not rich because other people can have market innovations that allow them to become rich. That's like a good thing. That's like one of the features I really like about free markets. So I just don't like that muddling.
Okay, I want to address something you said like a minute ago too, where you were talking about the company town thing, and you were kind of describing it as like there's a conspiracy. I think was the way that you put it, right? Where it's like there's this intentional effort to consolidate all the power in the town behind just the company. And I think what I wanted to point out was that people can behave as if there's a conspiracy, even if there isn't an intentional one, right? Like if you just have enough people whose interests are aligned, then you can get these like emergent group behaviors. That, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. This is a line I think George Carlin had a lot back in the day. Um, I think that is a true concept, but for that to happen, there would need to be an immense confluence because there are so many different factors in in usually these open markets. So like a good example would be like monopolies based on a limited resource. It's very easy for if there are only two or three companies that can provide this to do price fixing. And that even unintentionally. There could be price fixing. So I agree that is possible. I just think it is profoundly unlikely in most scenarios.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, I
Because
think
there are so many competing interests at play.
that's true, but there are also like certain ways that that wealthy classes would want society to be organized, right? Like they would want the protection of property to be paramount, for example, right? And like the protection of commerce, these kind of things, like because that's kind of what defines them as a class.
I mean, yes and no. Yes, most of them would broadly want that. I think most people would broadly want that. But again, when you say like it's their primary interest, I don't know necessarily. I think that it's very difficult to try and start making this case without dipping into, I think, the sort of only looking at things through the lens of class. Yeah, absolutely, people want property rights protected, but how do they want them protected? How do they want the police to operate when they are protecting that property? I think there are a lot of other factors that can still create disagreements. Yes, they can still have an overriding agreement. Sure, we disagree about how we want property protected, but we want property to be protected. But again, I feel like when we're getting as broad as wanting property protected, we're getting pretty close to things that aren't really necessarily true of capitalism or a conspiracy, but just things that like most people are going to broadly want. There's probably a confluence of people that despite their differences, all want the human race to not be eradicated. Yeah, and I feel like these conspiracies specifically need to be in order for us to really care about them and be concerned. They need to be in relation to something that like we don't want to have happen. That is like going to like exploit or take advantage of other people. And I don't really think that necessarily flies with property just wanting to be protected.
Yeah, well, my point wasn't just about the people wanting property to be protected. My point was about the high prioritization of that over other social values that you might like make laws around, for example. So like we were talking earlier about how our status within a capitalist society is largely defined by our wealth, right? So if you then go around making sure that so much of law and law enforcement is about the protection of property, then you are effectively entrenching the status of the people who have that wealth, right? So like in a way sure, I think it's true that almost everybody wants protection of property on some level. I don't think everybody necessarily wants the entrenchment of a specific like wealthy social class, though, and that is kind of what this property protection amounts to in capitalist societies, especially in Marxist time, even more than in ours, I think.
Maybe in Marxist time, I don't disagree that the mere protection of property entrenches wealth or makes or necessarily leads to a concentration of wealth. I mean, it only in the sense that like, sure, if you don't protect property, then like, yes, then it would be impossible to ever concentrate property. But I think like the nature of whether or not property becomes and wealth becomes increasingly concentrated has a lot more to do with policies under the umbrella of, well, you can own private property, you can own personal property than it does personal private property in the first place. Like whether or not you'd have like for example, I don't think redistributive wealth or progressive taxation would put you outside of the respect of property or the idea that or the ownership of property. But I would still say that would be a massive difference between one system and another about whether or not you have concentration of wealth.
I think it actually does say something about how high of a priority you place on the protection of property, right? Because if you think somebody's property is like their sacred rightful thing for them to own, then that is going to influence your opinion on whether people should be taxed and for what purposes, right?
Okay, well then if that's all, or I should say, if that's all it takes, but if that is a sufficient level to maybe disambiguate you from that position, then then I don't think it's true that all rich people or a significant amount of rich people do fall in this. I think there's a lot of wealthy people, particularly, if you look among the most wealthy people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, that absolutely do advocate lots of progressive taxation, or wealthy, I mean, the whole stereotype about the wealthy coastal elite is, this person who's out of touch with the poor person, but is also very left leaning. So if that's going to be the standard, then I don't think it's the case that there is, suddenly a massive confluence of, that when you have that you have this confluence of rich people with their interest wanting to protect their wealth, because it seems like there is significant disagreement about what that taxation should be, even among rich people.
I mean, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense in an American context, but remember, like, when we were doing, we did a show about, like, Russia not that long ago, and about the culture of corruption in Russia, and it's like, I don't know that I buy that like, on a worldwide scale, it's necessarily going to be the case that people with money are going to be, like progressive or liberal or be, like, trying to make a more egalitarian society. I think on average that's not going to be the case. And also, if you were to look at the kind of, like, pre-capitalist societies, I would think it would be fairly obvious that would usually not be the case. Like, most feudal lords wanted to have their status as a feudal lord protected, right?
I mean, I definitely agree that, like, this is based in, like, the American context, and I definitely agree that universally the having power, having influence, or in this particular case having money or property as sort of a means of influence is going to prejudice people in the direction of wanting to hold on to it, wanting to maintain it. But I just but I would, in my estimation, strongly downgrade the strength by which that plays a key factor as opposed to what it feels like the Communist Manifesto is saying. I think that's definitely true, but people are complex. There are lots of reasons people do lots of different things, and there are lots of intersections by which, rich people would, despite that, push in the other direction. So I don't think it is just, so I guess in that sense, I would not agree with the Communist Manifesto saying that, like, because the rich are always necessarily going to try and get themselves richer. I don't think that is accurate.
Okay, one thing I've heard you talk about a couple times before is about, like, zoning laws, and another one that I might, like, tie into this. I'm not sure if I've heard you talk about this. Would be, like, homeowners associations, and also there's this, like, tendency for property owners to vote for things that they believe will preserve the value of their property, like landowners specifically, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, like, it does make sense that there exists in the U.S. like a class of people who are the landowners, and then a class of people who are not the landowners. Like, obviously this isn't the only way that you can analyze our economy or society or whatever, right? But it is one way that you can. And that the interests of the people who own that land, diverge from the people who are, like, renting and living on it, right?
Yeah, I think I don't disagrey that this kind of thing is possible. I just think it is one thing to point to a specific example of this, like I think is the case with, NIMBYs and their interests in their neighborhoods and in the monetary value of their houses as, basically an investment vehicle. And the idea that, people who have houses and monetary investment in those houses are always going to necessarily have that as, like, one of, if not the highest of their goals or interests. I just don't think that is always necessarily true. Like, I think it's okay to observe the phenomenon that, like, people who have power are going to try to tend to hold on to power. But I feel like if you just endorse that concept without, being judicious about your application, you're going to get to places where it's like, and that's why none of the COVID restrictions are ever going to go away, because we know whenever a government takes a power, they never give it away. And then 3 years later, all the COVID restrictions are gone. It's just like, I think you need to be, it's like a red flag. It's something to keep in mind, but I don't think it's like a universal truth.
Okay, then I think we actually do agree a lot on this, because I think, like, as a general trend, it's something that I endorse, but I do think you can go too far with it. We've got a chatter who wants to know our opinion on Friedrich Nietzsche. I haven't read a lot of Nietzsche myself. I'm familiar with some of the concepts just from talking with other people who have. One thing that I guess I can point out a couple of things that I found interesting about Nietzsche. One of which is the like genealogy of morals concept, which is the idea of like how did our society get to have the values that it have and that it has, and like how have those been like influenced by the historical trends that have influenced our culture, because the values of our society are not just a priori things that come out of nowhere, so I don't know. That's one concept that he at least talks about that I'd be interested in. He talks about nihilism. I'm not literally a nihilist, but I'm like kind of close to one. Like generally pretty extremely cynical. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to add about Nietzsche? Or
I don't read philosophers, but I love to judge them. I don't know much about Nietzsche though.
Okay. Vels says kind of, sort of, but I feel like that is a bit of a just-so scenario. It's like the argument that worker-run businesses would never pollute like capitalist businesses because no one would choose to do that. But obviously, we can easily imagine scenarios where that would totally happen. Yeah. So I think this is the one of the things where we do agree that that attempts to do this have so far not succeeded at avoiding the problems that they're trying to solve, right? Like when you try to actually make worker-run societies or worker-run businesses, that they often do end up falling prey to the same problems. Yeah.
More. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The unceasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They've found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies, not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry and that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union, to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers, by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus the 10 Hours Bill in England was carried. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further, in many ways, the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own instruments of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their new conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole.
I guess this is. At first, I was like, I feel like this is kind of self-defeating his own argument, but I guess from his perspective, he's saying, guys, any day now, we're gonna win.
Right.
Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, may, here and there, be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. In the conditions of the proletariat, those of old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of any trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interests of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interests of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war, raging within existing society, up to the point where that war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a
Can we pause
class,
for a second?
certain conditions.
I just want to point out that I believe, although I don't know a lot about the historical analysis of this, it just seems overwhelmingly likely that he must have had the French Revolution in the back of his mind when he's saying this kind of stuff, right? It's like he's living in an era when the overthrow of the aristocratic classes was like a present discussion point in a lot of politics. And so it makes a lot of sense why he would then want to frame his own movement as kind of a successor to that, even if he's not saying so explicitly.
Yeah, every society ever has been based on the oppression of one class by another's. I don't buy this. Certainly, every society has had oppression, right? But to say that every society is based on oppression, I mean, that almost sort of like begs the question: what do we even mean by what does it mean for society to be based on the oppression at that point? Certainly, every society had it, and in the vast majority of societies, it played a massive role. I'm not aware of, at least at the time of Marx, I'm not aware of any societies that existed at that time that didn't have, some crazy oppression going on. But yeah, this just seems like really productive and not particularly useful. And I would certainly say that some of those oppressions did not operate on economic classes.
I don't know that I buy it not being useful, like as a lens of analysis, but I do agree that it's reductive. I mean, it's kind of like when people take some, really complex work of literature and then they just say it's about this one thing, right? And it's like, well, okay, it has that thing in it. It talks about it a lot. That might be one of the most important themes in it, but like to just say it's about this one thing, and that's even like less reductive than what Marx is doing, right? He's like reducing all of human society and human history to being about this one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal absolutism, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential condition for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by their revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products.
I don't think this is really true. Yes, it is true that, the idea of capital in these markets and these businesses does rely on wage labor, which sort of relies on the competition between, I guess, the proletariat, as the Communist Manifesto would put it. But it doesn't seem to me that then undercuts some sort of fundamental. To be honest, I'm not even exactly understanding what exactly they're claiming that it's undercutting, some fundamental principle by which the broader population, I guess the proletariat, needs. I'm really not following this argument, and it doesn't seem to have borne itself out in, I guess, the 150 years since this came out.
Okay, I think I do understand the point that he's trying to make. Have you ever heard of the concept of like noblesse oblige? Do you know that phrase?
Nope.
It's like a thing from feudal times where the idea was that feudal lords, even though they rule over their people, also have some reciprocal obligations to care for and defend those people as well, and they are supposed to look out for the welfare of the peasants under them. And I think what Marx is saying is like this is something like this is the historical norm, that rulers were supported by the people that they ruled over, but they were also supposed to look out for the people that they're ruling over. And Marx, I think, is claiming that the bourgeois of his time were failing at that duty to care for the people who were the underclass.
Yeah, so I guess I guess then the reformulation of the argument, or the reformulation of Marx's argument, as I understand it, with that knowledge, would be that the thing that is fundamentally being undercut is that obligation, and that it is then inevitable that then the people would rise up, and because they're no longer being looked after.
That is what he thinks. Yeah.
Okay, I do understand that. I guess this comment did not age too well by Marx, but oh well.
What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. End of section 1.
There's that inevitability that I was wary of. I don't think he made a good case for the inevitability of any of that stuff. I think he just described historically how a lot of this stuff has happened, and he's giving like some analysis, some reasons why it happened the way it did, but nowhere in any of that is inevitability, that it must happen according to the way that he described.
Section 2 of the Communist Manifesto. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Section 2. Proletarians and Communists. In what relation do the Communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The Communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working-class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The Communists are distinguished from the other working-class parties by this only. 1. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The Communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the Communist is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat.
Can we pause here?
The theoretical
Okay, so I think this is a big part of why his ideal vision of communism hasn't played out, is because of this assertion that he's making that the interests of the Communist Party are just identical to the interests of the proletariat. But in fact, real world communist parties do not necessarily want the same things that as the working class people in their countries want. And the thing that he was pointing out at the end there, he's like, well, one of the things that sets us apart is that we have this like framework through which we're analyzing it, and we understand it better than they do, right? So there you have the seeds of the formation of the Communist Party into an elite class of its own, which is what happened in a lot of these societies after they had communist revolutions.
Yeah, it feels kind of difficult to, how do I say this? It feels kind of difficult to not wonder or not sort of remark upon the way in which previously there was sort of a overemphasis on class as the only means of analysis on people, on the rich side, with the bourgeois. And then with the proletariat, it feels like there is similarly this, problem where, the assumption is that the bourgeois have the views of the bourgeois could be reduced and calculated into one cohesive view that would be shared by the Communist Party, that the Communist Party would have and could be implemented, and that there wouldn't be very difficult, deep-seated disagreements among those people as to how to implement it. It feels like there's a really big Achilles heel of overemphasis of class as a metric of analysis of people that keeps leading to really bad problems with their predictions and their prescriptions.
And another thing I want to point out is he seems to have this point of view on it, like as if the values of the working class ought to be subsumed by the values of the Communist Party and not the other way around, right? It's like we have no need to adopt the values that the working class has. Instead, they need to adopt our values and our vision of what they ought to be. It is like kind of an elitist thing.
Mm-hmm.
Conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer.
Except
they
for
merely
himself.
express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation.
Okay, if that's what capital is, then yes, absolutely. The proletariat can have, like, if you have an maybe I'm just really misunderstanding what you're trying to say here, but if you have like an existing good, like if I buy a baseball, that baseball doesn't require me to go out and continuously exploit. Like maybe he means if it breaks and then needs to be replaced, that it then needs to go out and be replaced, and invariably I would replace it with some means that is dependent upon or spawned from wage labor, which is exploitative. But like, I think that's really I'm not understanding.
Yeah, I don't agree with his description of what's happening, but I think I understand what the description is. I don't think he's talking about consumer goods at all. I think he's talking about like that he thinks the entire project of industrial society is to just build itself into a more and more industrial form that that is fueling further and further, like it's some kind of like vicious cycle that's just like we're exploiting the workers to build a more industrial society that's just going to exploit the workers more and more.
But he says specifically that the traditional proletariat property that is not capital is being destroyed, and that their new property is capital. Yeah, so I guess, does he just mean that, like, because everything you ever get will be dependent upon wage labor, that it all needs to go?
No, I mean, I think what he's saying is that the new like bourgeois private property is capital. I think he's just saying that like the bourgeois is taking like control over society to such an extent that the proletariat has like less and less property even left to their name, and that's why it's being destroyed, is because it's all being like taken from them.
Okay, and then I guess what he would just, and then for current, I guess he just means like renting and like like with landlords, I guess, because that still relies on wage labor. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, here, let me just rewind, because this is a really important distinction that I'm not understanding.
Destroying it daily. Or do you mean modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property, in its present form, is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor.
Yeah, so I guess he's just saying any kind of thing you ever own is going to be created by wage labor. So there's no escaping it. But I feel like that would cut against his argument, because then that would mean that when he says get rid of capital, he means get rid of like even cheap consumer goods that you have like purchased in your home.
I don't think that's what he means.
That can't be what he means. But I don't understand how else to interpret it, because he's saying even all property in its current form is this kind of capital, this kind of thing that only exists because of the competition of wage labor.
Yeah, but I think the way he's explaining it is a little bit unclear. But like he's basically talking about getting rid of the property that places the bourgeois in their like ruling station over the proletariat, right? And it's like,
well, that's what I thought he was saying, but he's saying even the property created, it doesn't create property for the laborer; it creates capital for the laborer. So he's talking about the things that the laborers own, which would refer to just personal property, would it not?
That's what I think he's wrong about, right? It's like I think
but it feels like it can't be the case that he is genuinely saying we need to get rid of your baseball bat that you bought from a factory just as much as we need to get rid of the factories themselves. But that feels like what he's saying here. But like I must be misunderstanding, because there's no way he means that.
I mean, I think that's what he was like disavowing a couple minutes earlier when he was saying like I do not mean the property of the peasant.
Yeah, that's what I thought he was. Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought he was saying. But then what he's literally saying, when I tried to like actually translate it, it's like into like a real example, I feel like that is what he's saying. So I feel like hold on, I'm gonna rewind one more time. Just one more time.
It creates modern bourgeois private property.
You mean modern bourgeois private property?
But does wage labor create any property for the laborer?
So does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Property as distinct from capital. So are poor people get anything?
Not a bit.
Not a bit.
It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation.
Yeah, so he's just completely discounting the idea of like consumer goods as being part of the property that he's talking about. He's
is he?
I think he is. I mean, I think
when he says, does it create property? No, it does not create property. It creates capital. So he is still talking about the things that it creates for the people, which would include consumer goods, is it not?
But that's not what he thinks, though, right? He doesn't think it does. Like, he thinks that industrial society is not so much creating stuff to give to the poor people. It's more creating stuff for the rich people and creating further tools to entrench them in their status.
I understand that, but when he says, is it creating property? No, it's creating capital. It
Yeah.
feels like he is saying that the things that we would refer to as property are actually forms of capital.
No, I don't think that's what he means. I
Okay,
think he's just discounting the idea that the things that we think of as personal property are even like part of what he's talking about.
okay. Okay, I see. I understand that argument. I guess it's just I really doesn't feel like that's what he's saying here. But it can't be what it seems like he's saying, because that just seems so contradictory on its face of it as to what he was trying to even say in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay.
Condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property, in its present form, is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society, can it be set in motion. Capital is, therefore, not a personal, it is a social power. When, therefore, capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e., that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite in bare existence as a laborer. What therefore the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products
Okay.
of
Yeah.
labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only in so far as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society,
Yeah, see, that's another one where I feel like when we're saying like, oh, you're only allowed to live if you have money, and to make money you need to be like productive to society. Again, this is another one I feel like is like not a unique invention of capitalism, or even of like the kind of like rampant like industrial like almost robber baron capitalism that was emergent at this time and period. Like, I mean, it might have been worse, but like, previously you were also only allowed to live and have land, as the owner of that land previously, allowed you to, through like divine mandate. So I feel like that is, again, a weird, unique, a weird criticism to levy uniquely on capitalism.
Yeah, I don't think that is unique to capitalism. I'm not sure he said that it's unique to capitalism, but I get that it kind of sounds like he's implying.
Yeah, it feels like that's like the implication. Yeah, and again, I guess like the even deeper question would be like, unless you're willing to provide basic necessities for free, it feels like you would, any system is going to be guilty of this. If you condition, the necessities of life in any way, you're going to be guilty of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you looked at like a hunter-gatherer society, for example, in that society, you have to go do your hunting and gathering, like do your basic like stuff, to be able to eat every day, right?
Yeah.
But like there probably are some people in that society who just like are too sick or feeble or whatever, and maybe their society takes care of them or whatever, right? Just like we have retirees or whatever today. But I think the point that Marx was trying to make was about the increasing interdependence of different economic systems means that you are now subject not just to the need to work for a living, but to the need to work for other people for a living.
Yeah, that's a distinction, but I feel like it's not. I don't know. Maybe at least to me, it's not super relevant. In my mind, if I need to put in a certain amount of work in order to get food, the fact that I'm putting in that certain amount of work to get food out of just the natural dynamics of the earth, right? I need to put in 1 hour of work to be able to harvest enough food to feed myself for the day, versus I need to put in 1 hour of work to be able to gather in order to provide enough services such to gather the currency necessary to get myself a day of food. Like that does not seem like a very important distinction to me. It would only be then in a tangible difference. Like I am being expected to do 10 hours of work, or the work I'm being expected to do is particularly grueling or dangerous, or something like that.
I mean, I think the reason Marx thinks that that's important is because he thinks it's being like nefariously exploited to,
Yeah.
again, yeah.
That's fair then.
Society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom. And rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying, and all the other brave words of our bourgeoisie about freedom in general, have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production,
Oh, I
and of
think
the
he's wrong
bourgeoisie
there.
itself.
He's saying that like that the communists have had this critique leveled at them even in their time, that the reforms they were proposing would curtail the freedom of commerce of people of their time, and and a moment earlier he even like agreed that that was true, but now he's saying that like these freedoms that the capitalists of his time were claiming are really only mean anything in contrast to the the lack of freedom of earlier societies, and don't actually apply to communists. But I think he's just wrong. I think they do apply to communists just as much as they would apply to mercantile or feudal societies.
And I understand the argument he's trying to make. He's like, oh, I'm only trying to take away things in the context of, we just got these things. These are not long established things, and the things that are bad. But again, I feel like number one, you then still need to make a fundamental argument that like this is not something that we should have, and secondly, I don't know if that's true. I think the application is unique. Like certainly never before did they have factories, but the idea of like literally, I mean like capitalism, like or like for example like buying shares in a ship's spice run, I believe to like the Indies was like one of the first forms of like of stocks and markets. That was something that existed before industrialization. There absolutely were merchant guilds that had very large structures that again are not perfect one-to-ones to like factories, but like still do represent, I think, would fall under the idea of like capital as Marx is describing it. So I don't think it's fair for him to also say like, oh, this is not something that ever existed before.
Yeah, although what I think Marx would probably say about those, early stock markets and is that he would probably say that's the inception of the bourgeoisie, right? He'd say like that's the seed that they sprouted from.
Mm-hmm.
You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology, that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital.
Can we pause?
All objections urged against the communistic
I think the argument that he's making right there is kind of confusing two different things, because he's saying like the people who labor under capitalism acquire nothing, right? And I think what he means by that, if I want to be charitable to him, is that they do not increase their wealth over time. But I'm going to say like what they do acquire is sustenance, right? Like they have to work just to maintain their position. And this is what these people would be arguing for, who are making the point about laziness. They would say that like people who no longer have to work, just to maintain the position that they have. You're taking that incentive away, and therefore you might diminish the incentive. Well, you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's the point he's trying to make. Again, I just question, this dichotomy, or rather this assumption that the need to be a productive member of survival is contingent upon being a productive member of society. I mean, I think this is a question of degrees that exists in almost any society, no matter what, to a certain extent.
This is true.
Mode of producing and appropriating material products have, in the same way, been urged against the communistic modes of producing and appropriating intellectual products, just as, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply, to our intended abolition of bourgeois property, the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians, and in public prostitution. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But, you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. And your education! Is not that also social, and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools, etc.? The Communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention, and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more, by the action of modern industry, all family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the whole bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women which, they pretend, is to be openly and officially established by the Communists. The Communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeois, not content with having the wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus, at the most, what the Communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, i.e., of prostitution both public and private. The Communists are further reproached.
It seems like he's just dismissing the entire idea that these more traditional conceptions of family even exist, right? He's just saying although you may want to talk about protecting the traditional family, you're all a bunch of hypocrites. You're all cheating on your wives anyway. But I don't really find that a very compelling refutation. First of all, it just doesn't apply to everyone, and secondly, his ideal society doesn't exist either. So why should one? I don't know, one ideal that at least partially exists.
Yeah, I think there's another. Again, there's a sort of a through line here to the idea that the primary, or I shouldn't that necessarily that this is because it's primary, but rather that there is just a lack of appreciation of some of the other, dynamics by which groups can be analyzed. The idea that, again, it feels like it's sort of like women's rights. That's just, it feels very reductive. I thought he was, I was going to say cooking, on the school point, but really I feel like he's just saying something that's pretty uncontroversial. It's like, we have opinions about how schools should be run, and that's not a big deal because we already have laws on how schools should be run, and we just think that they should be different. I don't think that's that controversial. I'd probably disagree about the ways in which they want schools to be run, but the idea that, a party would want to have an opinion or have some policy about the way which school is run does not seem crazy to me.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's kind of just the same reductive thing that he's been doing right from the beginning. Like you said, like he's just overlooking in any other way that society can be analyzed besides as a matter of class struggle, right? So it just, he seems like much too easily like sweeping this whole like culture of family under the rug. Like, I don't know.
To abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is, so far, itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries at least is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put an end to, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and, generally, from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and judicial ideas have been modified in the course of historical development. But religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. There are, besides, eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality, instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assumed different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages, viz., the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms, or general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling as to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property, and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will of course be different in different countries. Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries the following will be pretty generally applicable. 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state, by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of waste lands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture.
What does that mean? So I'm just going to pause it. I have no idea what he's trying. What that would look like.
What do you mean? What did he say that was confusing? Like the equal
liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture.
Yeah, so I think what he's saying is like he's he's using the word armies kind of metaphorically. He's saying like we're going to turn the entire population, organize them as if they were an army, and get everyone involved in production.
I see. Okay, I see.
9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, by a more equable distribution of the population over the country. 10.
Seems
Free
really
education for all children in public
far-fetched.
schools.
I mean, I think a lot of these are far-fetched, but wow, that's
Abolition of children's factory labor in its
Yeah.
present form. Combination of education with industrial production, and etc., and etc. When, in the course of
Can we pause
development,
again?
class distinctions have
And so he was talking a little bit earlier about how like communism is going to be the most revolutionary of all these things that have ever happened, and it just seems like he's just pointing to the scope of his ambition to achieve these things and say like, therefore it is the most revolutionary because I have the highest aims of you know what I you know, and then but then he's comparing his aims that are yet to be achieved against the actual achievements of past societies, right? Because the type of things that past societies were aiming to do but didn't accomplish are not any less ambitious than this, right? I mean, you had like theocracies that were trying to turn the whole world into a single like kingdom of God or something like that, right? That seems like at least as ambitious as what Marx is proposing, and so like the fact that he's saying like how revolutionary it is really it's almost like he's just bragging about how detached from reality he is, if I want to, but that, I mean, I know that's an uncharitable way of framing it, right? But he's just, it just seems like he's got this huge wish list of things that he would like society to change, and his reason that those things haven't yet changed is because of like, well, the bad people have stopped those things from changing, right? And once we get rid of the bad people, there won't be any obstacles left, and then we can just do whatever we want. It seems silly. And, yesterday I was watching Erudite's stream, and she was talking about like gender relations, and she was talking about how like there's some feminists who will just say that like everything that's wrong with society should be blamed on men, and then there's some like men's issues type of people who will just say everything that's wrong in society should be blamed on women, right? And it just seems like so much of people just really want society to be the kind, I don't know. They really like love the idea that if only we could get rid of the bad people, all of our problems would go away. Like it's
Yeah,
it drives
I
me
think.
insane.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head in the first part there. That when it comes to describing sort of the positive aspects of the communist movement, this manifesto talks about sort of all the aspirations and all sort of the highest range of possibilities. But then when it comes to the actual applications, I mean, not to say that I don't think these would be bad or these are radical, but like these policies are a far cry from like eliminating the need for like to be a productive member of society for the necessities of life, or like eliminating like the basis by which like there are winners and losers in society. I think there's a really big problem, or a really big gap there.
Yeah.
Disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled, by the force of circumstances, to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. End of
Can we
section
pause
2.
again for a second? Okay, a couple of things. One is that there was a week, like a few months ago, where you were gone, and I had a substitute co-host, my friend Claire, who was on. We were talking about the way that war is depicted in movies, and one of the points that we were talking about is like in these kind of heroic mythos. Like depictions of conflict in a lot of media, and not just in modern media, but in a lot of traditional stories too, that there's a tendency for people to want to personify the forces of good and evil and just say like all the bad stuff is really just one guy doing all the, and you see this in a lot of traditional religions, like a lot, any religion that believes in Satan, or any religion that believes that there's just like a single villain figure, or like a small collection of villains that are just causing all the problems in the world. And I think our modern version of that is maybe like every bad thing is Hitler, right? And I sort of think, Marx is almost creating this same kind of like mythic narrative where he's just like personifying good and evil and then like ascribing them to a certain class of people, in a way that he's like falling prey to the same kind of psychological bias that leads people to believe in like Satan figures to begin with.
Yeah.
But by the way, like we just finished part 2. We're about 2/3 of the way through this.
Section 3.
And we're maybe like, let's see, how long? Like 3 hours in or something. Yeah. So I mean, if you don't mind, I think. Are you okay with still finishing this today? I mean, we're gonna probably have like a 4-hour stream then, but are you all right?
Yeah, I have a panel in about 45 minutes, so I think we've got time to get through this if we don't pause as much. There's exactly about half an hour left here.
Okay, do you want to speed it up, or can we do that?
Yeah, I can.
Can we do like 1.5 or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Of the Communist Manifesto. This LibreVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Communist Manifesto, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Section 3, Socialist and Communist Literature. 1. Reactionary Socialism. A. Feudal Socialism. Owing to their historical position, it became the vocation of the aristocracies of France and England to write pamphlets against modern bourgeois society. In the French Revolution of July 1830, and in the English Reform agitation, these aristocracies again succumbed to the hateful upstart. Thenceforth, a serious political contest was altogether out of the question. A literary battle alone remained possible. But even in the domain of literature, the old cries of the Restoration period had become impossible. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy were obliged to lose sight, apparently, of their own interests, and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeoisie in the interest of the exploited working class alone. Thus the aristocracy took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new master, and whispering in his ears sinister prophecies of coming catastrophe. In this way arose feudal socialism, half lamentation, half lampoon, half echo of the past, half menace of the future. At times, by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect, through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. The aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, waved the proletarian alms bag in front for a banner. But the people, so often as it joined them, saw on their hindquarters the old feudal coats of arms, and deserted with loud and irreverent laughter. One section of the French Legitimists and Young England exhibited this spectacle. In pointing out that their mode of exploitation was different to that of the bourgeoisie, the feudalists forget that they exploited under circumstances and conditions that were quite different, and that are now antiquated. In showing that, under their rule, the modern proletariat never existed, they forget that the modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring of their own form of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie amounts to this: that under the bourgeois regime a class is being developed which is destined to cut up root and branch the old order of society. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat, as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. In political practice, therefore, they join in all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin phrases, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry, and to barter truth, love, and honor for traffic in wool, beetroot sugar, and potato spirits. As the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so has clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart-burnings of the aristocrat. B. Petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, nor the only class whose conditions of existence pined and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed, industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition, and, as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced, in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce, by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half of the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use, in their criticism of the bourgeois regime, the standard of the peasant and petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes should take up the cudgels for the working class. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France but also in England. This school of socialism dissected with great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crises. It pointed out the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and peasant, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the dissolution of old moral bonds, of the old family relations, of the old nationalities. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and the old society, or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange, within the framework of the old property relations that have been, and were bound to be, exploded by those means. In either case, it is both reactionary and utopian. Its last words are, corporate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relations in agriculture. Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. C. German or true socialism. The socialist and communist literature of France, a literature that originated under the pressure of a bourgeoisie in power, and that was the expression of the struggle against this power, was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie in that country had just begun its contest with feudal absolutism. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contact with German social conditions, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than the demands of practical reason in general, and the utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified in their eyes the law of pure will, of will as it was bound to be, of true human will generally. The world of the German literate consisted solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather, in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely by translation. It is well known how the monks wrote silly lives of Catholic saints over the manuscripts on which the classical works of ancient heathendom had been written. The German literate reversed this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic functions of money, they wrote alienation of humanity, and beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of the French historical criticisms they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundation of socialism, and so on. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated. And since it seized in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and extolled its poor stock in trade in such mountebank fashion, meanwhile gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The fight of the German, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement, became more earnest. By this, the long-wished-for opportunity was offered to true socialism of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois legislation, bourgeois liberty and equality, and of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by this bourgeois movement. German socialism forgot, in the nick of time, that the French criticism, whose silly echo it was, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society, with its corresponding economic conditions of existence, and the political constitution adapted thereto, the very things whose attainment was the object of the pending struggle in Germany. To the absolute governments, with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of floggings and bullets with which these same governments, just at that time, closed the German working-class risings. While this true socialism thus served the governments as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it, at the same time, directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of the German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeois class, a relic of the 16th century, and since then constantly cropping up again under various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction, on the one hand from the concentration of capital, on the other from the rise of a revolutionary proletariat. True socialism appeared to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The robe of speculative cobwebs, embroidered with flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of sickly sentiment, this transcendental robe in which the German socialists wrapped their sorry eternal truths, all skin and bone, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods amongst such a public. And on its part, German socialism recognized, more and more, its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German petty Philistine to be the typical man. To every villainous meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher, socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the...
I feel like, I don't know, this does not seem like a very good use of your manifesto to try and explain why previous efforts of socialists or communists in a particular geographic area failed. as I guess I guess the argument is supposed to be this is why it failed and this is how we're going to do better in the future when accounting for the different social statuses of one area to another. Yeah, I mean I don't really have much to say about the actual like content of like the idea of like the differences between the social fabric of Germany and France and how that then intersects with the advocacy of particular socialists. I thought his previous analysis was at least more interesting and at least more relevant to think about in regards to the ways in which like feudal socialism was, particularly, by his account, expressed in a certain way because of how it was trying, sort of the context in which it was coming up in, with still being sort of around feudalism. But this just seems like, I don't know, this just seems like a cool story, bro.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff just seems like very particular to the time that and place that he was writing in. It's not super interesting today.
Yeah.
Extreme length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendency of communism and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles. With very few exceptions, all the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, 1847, circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and enervating literature. 2. Conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the conditions of the working class, organizers of charity, members of societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. We may cite Proudhon's Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this form. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceives the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In requiring the proletariat to carry out such a system, and thereby to march straightway into the social New Jerusalem, it but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie.
This kind of feels like he is like, again, maybe I'm misunderstanding. This feels like Marx very much saying, hey, in order to do this, we are going to have to take a step back from some of the benefits of our society. Some of the things you guys like about like factories or markets or industrialization are going to have to go away because they're just not compatible with getting rid of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I think he is saying that. Yeah.
And more practical, but less systematic, form of this socialism sought to depreciate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence, in economic relations, could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism, however, by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected only by a revolution, but administrative reforms, based on the continued existence of these relations, reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relations between capital and labor, but at the best lessen the cost and simplify the administrative work of bourgeois government. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when and only when it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class. Protective duties for the benefit of the working class. Prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois, for the benefit of the working class. 3. Critical utopian socialism and communism. We do not here refer to that literature which, in every great modern revolution, has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of Babeuf and others. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends, made in times of universal excitement, when feudal society was being overthrown, these attempts necessarily failed, owing to the then undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced, and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character. It inculcated universal asceticism and social leveling in its crudest form. The socialist and communist systems properly so called, those of Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, sprang into existence in the early undeveloped period described above, of the struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie. See Section 1, Bourgeois and Proletarians. The founders of these systems see, indeed, the class antagonisms, as well as the action of the decomposing elements, in the prevailing form of society. But the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers to them the spectacle of a class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement. Since the development of class antagonism keeps even pace with the development of industry, the economic situation, as they find it, does not as yet offer to them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They therefore search after a new social science, after new social laws that are to create these conditions. Historical action is to yield to their personal inventive action historically created conditions of emancipation to fantastic ones, and the gradual, spontaneous class organization of the proletariat to the organization of society specially contrived by these inventors. Future history resolves itself, in their eyes, into the propaganda and the practical carrying out of their social plans. In the formation of their plans, they are conscious of caring chiefly for the interests of the working class, as being the most suffering class. Only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them. The undeveloped state of the class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large, without distinction of class, nay, by preference, to the ruling class. For how can people, when once they understand their system, fail to see in it the best possible plan of the best possible state of society? Hence, they reject all political, and especially all revolutionary, action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means, and endeavor, by small experiments, necessarily doomed to failure, and by the force of example, to pave the way for the new social gospel. Such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state, and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversion of the functions of the state into a mere superintendence of production, all these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms which were at that time only just cropping up, and which, in these publications, are recognized in their earliest, indistinct, and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. The significance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an inverse relation to historical development. In proportion as the modern class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it, lose all practical value and all theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of these systems were, in many respects, revolutionary, their disciples have, in every case, formed mere reactionary sects. They hold fast by the original views of their masters, in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They therefore endeavor, and that consistently, to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile the class antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated phalansteres, of establishing home colonies, of setting up a little Icaria, duodecimo editions of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. By degrees they sink into the category of the reactionary conservative socialists depicted above, differing from these only by more systematic pedantry, and by their fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effects of their social science. They therefore violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel. The Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France, respectively, oppose the Chartists and the Reformists. Section 4. Position of the Communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 has made clear the relations of the Communists to the existing working-class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the Agrarian Reformers in America. The Communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the Communists ally themselves with the Social Democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phrases and allusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. In Switzerland, they support the radicals, without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialists, in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on an agrarian revolution as the prime condition for national emancipation, that party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way, against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightway use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, and in order that, after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin.
I actually super agree with at least like the idea that like if in politics you work with whoever agrees with you in a given issue. You shouldn't lose sight of your larger disagreements with them if you do have larger disagreements with them, but there should be no limits to who you're willing to work with on a particular political goal if they are willing to enact that political goal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of not LBJ, FDR, and working with the Dixiecrats to enact a lot of the initial New Deal programs.
Mm-hmm.
The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany, because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and of France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements they bring to the front, as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. This is the end of The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Thank you for listening.
All right.
Okay. I did kind of lose interest at the end here. I'm sitting here like just typing in chat and kind of like trailing off my interest in the Communist Manifesto. But do you have anything else that you want to add?
No. I think this was interesting, but yeah, I think a lot of it at the very end was mostly dedicated to particulars of details relating to like intimate, like particulars of details relating to like how to implement communist thought here versus there, and what the unique challenges are. Stuff that isn't super evergreen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I guess we are done for today then. So, thanks for joining me, and see you next time.
Yeah, I'll see you.